Chapter 7. The road to Civitas Eremei, capital and only city of Eremiamontis, encircles the stony peg of mountain on which it sits in long, slow, irregular loops, like a screw thread. From the river valley, it looks as if the city can be reached in 2 hours at the very most, but it's a long day's climb, assuming you start at dawn. If not, you face the unattractive choice of camping overnight on the narrow ledge of road, or walking up it in the dark. At the crown of the mountain, the road funnels through a low, narrow gate in the curtain wall. 3 more turns of the thread brings it to the city wall proper, where it ducks through a gateway under 2 high, thin towers built on massive spurs of rock. From the city gate to the citadel is another 8 turns, through streets wide enough for a donkey, or an economically fed horse. Chastra Eremei, the Duke's castle, was chiseled and scooped out of the yellow stone 400 years ago, and is protected by an encircling ditch 26 feet deep, and a 30-foot wall studded with squat round towers. A third of the interior is derelict through neglect. The Eremians proudly boast that nobody has ever taken the citadel by storm. It's hard to imagine why anybody should want to. Most of the population of the city turned out in the morning to see the remains of the army come home. By nightfall, however, when Orsi rode his weary horse through the gate, the crowd had long since given up and drifted away. That in itself was encouraging. Maybe they weren't going to lynch him after all. Neil Duckus was looking after all the important stuff, accommodation for the wounded and so forth. There was no good reason why Orsi shouldn't just go home and go to bed. It was what he wanted to do more than anything else in the world. Tomorrow, of course, he'd have to do the things he'd been dreading all the way up the Butter Pass. At the very least, he'd have to convene the General Council, tell them about the battle and everything that had happened, the extraordinary kindness of the Vidani, the Mezzantine defector, and his offer. Probably he ought to stand out on the balcony that overlooked the market square and address the people. That was only reasonable, and he knew he had to do it. Tomorrow. He clattered through the citadel gate, and there was a group of people waiting for him. A doctor whom he recognized, some people whose names he knew, some strangers. The doctor pounced on him as soon as his feet hit the cobbles. He'd had a detailed letter from one of the Vidani medics. He explained full details of the injury, description of treatment to date, prognosis, recommendations. It was imperative that the Duke get some rest soon as possible. For once, Orsi didn't argue. Remarkably soon, he was in his bedroom on the 4th floor of the South Tower. He sat on the bed and tugged at his boots. If they were this tight, how had he ever managed to get them on? Gave up and flopped on his back with his hand behind his head. He was home. That made him one of the lucky months. Tomorrow, he told himself, I'll deal with everything. First, I'll have a meeting with Meal. He'll brief me on everything he's done, getting the army home and everything that happened on the way. Then I'll have to go to the council and make my speech on the balcony. He made a mental note. Think of something to say. Right, I'll do that. And the rest of the day's your own. Beatrice, he thought. I'll see her tomorrow. She's not here tonight because she knows I need to be alone. But tomorrow I'll see them both again, and that'll make things better. It occurred to him that he hadn't thought much about her over the last few days. He felt ashamed, because really she was everything, the whole world. But there'd be time for her tomorrow, and things could slowly start to get back to normal. Things would never be normal again. He knew that, really, but he was tired, and there wasn't anything he could do tonight. And besides, the doctor had told him, rest. He fell asleep. Below in the castle yard, Neil Duckus was still trying to find billets for wounded men, water and fuel for cooking, hay and oats for horses, somewhere for the carts to turn so the road wouldn't get jammed, somewhere to put the Mezzantine until he had time to deal with him. He didn't resent the fact that Orsi had left him with all the arrangements. He was too busy standing out of the way by the stable door so that the stretcher bearers could get in and out, and women with bedding. He was trying to carry on 4 conversations at once: the garrison captain, the chief steward, Orsi's doctor, and a representative of the merchant adventurers who was trying to gouge him over the price of 20 gross of plain wool bandages. He kept going because there wasn't anybody else. It would, of course, be just as bad tomorrow. Ziani Va'atsis sat in a stationary cart for an hour, and then some men came. They didn't seem to know whether they were welcoming a guest or guarding a prisoner, but they made a fair job of hedging their bets. They took him up a long spiral staircase with no handrail. It was dark, and the steps were worn smooth, to a landing with a thick black door. If there was anything he wanted, they said, all they had to do was ask. Then they opened the door for him and vanished, leaving him completely alone. There was a candle burning in the room, 1 candle, and a jug of water and a plate of bread and cheese on a table. It was a large room, though the darkness around the candle flame made it look bigger than it really was. He found the fireplace, a basket of logs, some twigs and moss for kindling. He laid a fire, lit a spill very carefully so as not to snuff the candle out, found a small hand bellows hanging on a nail on the wall. It hadn't occurred to him that the mountains would be so cold. The bed was huge, musty, slightly damp. He took his boots off, but kept his clothes on. He couldn't sleep, needless to say. So, he lay on his back, staring at the extraordinarily high ceiling. He could just make out shapes of vaulting on the extreme edge of the disk of candlelight, and soon his mind was full of details as he worked on the mechanism that was gradually beginning to take shape. Somewhere below, a dog was barking, and he could hear heavily shod cartwheels grinding the cobbles like a mill crushing wheat. For some reason it comforted him, like rain on the roof or the soft swish of the sea. This mezzanine. Zanfarank Heraclido. Orsi had always felt overawed by him, not by his intellect or his commanding presence or his strength of purpose, but by the sonorous beauty of his name. Reached across the table and took the last honey cake from the plate. He'd had 6 already. None of the other members of the council appeared to have noticed. His name's Vaatzes, Emil Duckus said. I had a long talk with him on the way home, and I'm fairly sure he's genuine, not a spy or anything. But that's just my intuition. Heraclido made a gesture, a quick opening and closing of the hand. Let us say, for the sake of argument, that he is. Let's also assume that he can actually deliver on his promise to teach us all the stuff he claims he knows. The question is, would it actually do us any good? Heads nodded, turned to look down the table. I think so, Orsi said, but it'd be a huge step. What do you reckon, Frank? Me? Heraclido raised his eyebrows. Not up to me. Yes, but I supposed it was. But suppose it was. What would you do? Heraclido paused before answering. On balance, he said, I think I'd have his head cut off and stuck up on a pike in the market square, and I'll tell you why. Yes, it'd be just grand if we could learn how to build these spear-throwing machines, though I don't suppose you'd approve of the direction I'd be inclined to point them in once they were finished. Though we won't go into that. Good, someone else said, a mild ripple of laughter. It'd be just grand, Heraclido repeated, and when this mezzanine says he knows how to build them, I believe him. But it's no good giving a shepherd a box of tools and a drawing and telling him to build you a clock or a threshing machine. My point is, we can't make use of this knowledge. We aren't... He waved his hands again. We aren't set up to start building machines. Might as well give a 90-pound bow to a kid. It works, it's a bloody good weapon, but he's simply not strong enough to draw it. And you know what happens next. The kid can't use it, so he puts it somewhere, then along comes his big brother, picks it up, and shoots you with it. It's not smart. Slow down, someone said. You just lost me. Then use your brain, Heraclido said. I said I'd have the mezzanine executed. Here's why. We can't afford to let him live, not with all that stuff in his head. Because we can't use it, we aren't strong enough, but we all know who is. Brief silence. Then Meal said, Let me translate. Since Ferenc here has decided to be all elliptical, he's afraid the mezzanin's knowledge would fall into the hands of the Vadani. They're no smarter than us, but they've got pots more money. They might be able to use the knowledge, presumably against us, right? More or less, Heraclido said. So the only safe thing to do is get rid of the information, now while it's still in the box, so to speak. That's a point of view, Orsi said after a moment. Anyone like to comment? Under normal circumstances, the voice came from the other end of the table, a thin elderly man, Orsi didn't know particularly well. Simbulo or some name like that. I'd agree with the senator. We can't easily use this knowledge, and there's times when a head on a pike is worth 2 in the bush. We could make out he's a spy, which could be true for all we know, and it'd go down well with the market crowd. But we have a problem. We've just had our guts ripped out by the Republic like a cat on a fence. People need to see a miracle cure, they're gonna get nervous. Basically, we need a secret weapon. Heraclido leaned forward and glared down the table. So you want to build these machines? The thin man shook his head. I want to tell the people we're going to build these machines, he said, and I want to parade this mezzanine in front of them and say, here, look what we've found. Here's a mezzanine trader who's going to show us how to build them, and a whole lot of other stuff too. Now, he went on with a shrug, whether we actually build any machines now or at some indeterminate point in the future is a subject for another day. What concerns me is what we're going to do tomorrow. He paused as though inviting interruptions. There were none, so he went on. Same goes for our friends and allies over the mountain. We won't get started on all that now, but I don't suppose I'm the only one who'd love to know what all that loving-kindness stuff was really innate of. I'd also like to know who the genius was who thought it'd be a good idea to take the army home over the Butter Pass right under Valen's nose. The fact we got away with it doesn't mean it wasn't a bloody stupid thing to do. Orsi saw Meal take a deep breath and say nothing. He was proud of his friend. But anyway, the thin man went on, Valens has made his point. He had us in the palm of his hand, and for reasons best known to himself, he let us go. Fact remains, we've just lost a big slice of our military capability. If Valens wants to break the treaty as things stand, we can't give him a good game. In other words, we're at his mercy. And I don't know about you gentlemen, but that makes my teeth ache. I'd feel a whole lot happier if Valens was under the impression we had the secret of the spear-throwing machines. It'd give him something to think about, someone said. Too right, Heraclitus said. And if I was in his shoes, and I heard that we were planning on arming ourselves with those things, I'd know what I'd do. I'd invade straight away before we had a chance to build them. What about that, though? A short, round man with curly hair, Basamontes from the West Valleys. What do you think he's playing at? Good question, Mill said. And I don't think we can reasonably make any decisions about this or anything else until we know the answer. You were there, the thin man said. What did you make of it? Beats me, Mill admitted. They just appeared out of nowhere and started helping. No explanations, they weren't even patronizing about it, just got on with it, and a bloody good job they made of it, too. He frowned. One thing that did strike me, he said, was how very well prepared they were. Food, blankets, medical stuff. It all just sort of materialized like it was magic. Either Valens has got them very well organized indeed, or they had some idea what would be needed well in advance. He shook his head. Which still doesn't make any sense, he added. It's a puzzle, all right. Like the Duchess says, said the thin man, it's a puzzle. And like he says, I don't think we can make a decision until we've got some idea what actually happened there. The problem is, how do we find out? Silence. Then Meal said, we could ask them. Puzzled frowns. I don't follow, someone said. I suggest we send a delegation, Meal said, to say thank you very much for helping us. Only polite after all. While they're there, if they keep their ears open and their mouths shut. That's not a bad idea, Basamontes said. The Duchess is right. We owe them a bread-and-butter letter. We might as well combine it with a fishing trip. And what do we tell them, Heraclitus interrupted, about the mezzanine? We've got to assume they know about him already. Nothing, the thin man said firmly. Let him fret about it for a while, it'll do them good. If Valens wanted to attack us, someone else said, he had his chance. I can't see how it benefits him, lulling us into a true sense of security. We don't know what kind of issues he's involved with, Basamontes said. We're not the only ones with borders or neighbors. Which is why I'd like to get some sort of idea of what's going on over there, and the best way to find out is to go and see for ourselves. Well? Meal turned to look at Heraclitus. Are you still in favor of putting the mezentine's head on a pike? Heraclitus smiled. I never expected you'd go along with that, he said. I was just telling you my opinion. By all means, go ahead, send the delegation. As you say, it's simple good manners. And on balance, I'm inclined to agree with Cymbulo here. We can't actually do anything until we've got some idea of what's going on next door. So for the time being, we'll just have to keep the mezzanine on a short leash and see what happens. Wouldn't do any harm, someone suggested, to start finding out what he can do for us. Assuming we decide to go down that road, I mean. So far, we've had some big promises. I propose we see the mezzanine for ourselves. Orsi? Emil said. Orsi nodded. By all means, he said. I've told you the gist of what he told me, but I'm no engineer. I don't know if what he said's possible or what it involved. The trouble is, there's not many of us who do. We need some experts of our own to listen to this man. There was a short silence, as if he'd said something embarrassing. Then Heraclitus said, all due respect, but isn't that the point? We don't have any experts of our own. If we got anybody who could understand what the hell the mezzantine's talking about, we wouldn't need the mezzanine. Meal lifted his head sharply. I don't think it's as black and white as all that, he said. And Orsi thought, actually, Heraclitus right and Meal knows it, but he's upset with him for being clever at my expense, and he's too well-mannered to say so. My father used to say, Meal went on, that so long as you've got ears and a tongue, you can learn anything. What would be helpful is if we had someone who's halfway there. Heraclitus looked at him. You mean like a blacksmith or a wheelwright? Yes, why not? Orsi winced. He knew how much Meal disliked being wrong and how stubborn he could be when circumstances had betrayed him into being wrong in public. A bright man with an inquiring mind, that's what we need. That can't be impossible, surely. Maybe they were all killed in the war, someone muttered, down at the far end of the table. Orsi was glad he hadn't seen who'd said it. Well, Heraclitus was enjoying himself in a languid sort of way. If the Duchess can find someone who fits the bill, I suppose it can't do any harm. As for bringing the mezzanine before this council, I'm afraid I can't see what useful purpose that would serve. But if anyone else has strong feelings on the subject... Boca canta kusene, Orsi said briskly. Several heads turned to stare blankly at him. Under other circumstances, he'd have found the looks on their faces amusing. The armorer, he explained. Come on. Some of you must have heard of him. He's the warrant holder. I gather he runs the best-equipped workshop in town. I don't suppose it's a patch on anything they've got in Mezentia, but at least he ought to be able to tell us if the mezentine's genuine, or whether he's just making stuff up out of his head to con us out of money. Iraclido shrugged. Fine, he said. By all means, have your blacksmith interview the mezzantine. I'd be interested to hear what he thinks. Meanwhile, we need to agree a course of action in respect of Duke Valens. With respect, Orsi looked round. Miel was only this polite and soft-spoken when he was furiously angry. With respect, I suggest we need rather more to go on before we decide anything in that regard. All we have to go on is a magnificent, though possibly uncharacteristic act of generosity. I say a little research. Absolutely, Orsi broke in, made lead to head off his friend before he lost his temper. We need some reliable information about what's going on, what Valens and the Vidani are up to. Someone down the table stifled a yawn. In that case, whoever it was said, how about the merchant adventurers? They're good at intuition, picking up trends. Gotta be able to sense which way the wind's blowing in business. Mumbled approval all around the table. Predictably, Orsi decided, since it was precisely the sort of compromise that satisfied committees and nobody else. If you can't reach a decision, find a pretext for postponing it. You can never have too much information, he said. It's highly unlikely we'd get a straight answer through normal diplomatic channels. Who's got a tame merchant who owes him a favor? 2 ducal summonses, neatly written on crisp new parchment, the first of the new batch from the slaughter of the winter sheep, in oak apple ink. 1. To Boca Cantacasene at his workshop in the lower town, requiring him to call on Count Ducas at his earliest convenience. 1, in similar terms, to Belha Severina of the Weavers' Company. Of course, Emil Ducas had met Boca Cantacasene before, had been measured by him. Across the shoulders, under the armpits, from armpit to thigh bone, thigh to knee to ankle, an anatomy so complete that you could have built a perfect replica of the Ducas with nothing to go on except the armorer's notes and drawings. Emil tried to remember if he'd paid the man's latest bill. Cantacasene arrived in his best clothes, stiffer and more unnatural looking on him than any suit of armor. He was a short man of around 50, with massive forearms tapering down to thin wrists and small short-fingered hands. He was nervous and bumped into furniture. Do you think you could help? Emil said, after he'd explained the situation, and extracted a dreadful oath of discretion. I mean, I wouldn't understand a word he said. It would be like a foreign language. Cantacasene frowned, as if trying to picture a 32nd of an inch in abstract. It'd take a long time, he said. I'd have to get him to explain a whole lot of things before I started understanding. You see what I mean? Of course, Emil said. We'd at least be able to understand the explanations. Another frown, a nod. I think I can do that. Splendid. Emil was fidgeting with his hands, something he didn't usually do. At this stage, he said, all we really need to know is whether he's really a high-class mezzantine engineer, or whether he's just pretending to be one because he's a spy, or just a vagrant looking to cheat us out of money. You could ask him questions, I suppose, like a quiz, metalworking stuff. Cantacasene shook his head. I don't think that would help a lot, he said. Me testing him would be like testing a doctor on surgery by asking him how to cut toenails. But I think I can see my way, if you know what I mean. Of course, Emil said. You're the expert. I'll leave it up to you how to proceed. He paused, looked away. One other thing, he said. I haven't discussed this with the Duke, but I thought I'd sound you out first. It was him who suggested you, by the way. Honored, Cantacasene said. Well, Emil stopped as if he'd forgotten what he was going to say. If we do decide to go along with this, try and set up factories and such like they've got in Mezentia. Obviously, we're going to need skilled men for the mezzantine to teach us stuff to, and then they'll go away and run the factories. Like foremen, Cantacasene said. Exactly, that's right. Well, since the Duke himself suggested you, I guess you're at the top of my list of candidates. I see. Cantacasene had a knack of saying things with no perceptible intonation. Completely neutral, like clean water. Would you want to do that? Another pause for a moment. Yes, Cantacasene replied. Good. I mean, Neil went on, it's all hypothetical, assuming we decide to go ahead. And obviously, to a certain extent, that'll depend on what you make of the man when you meet him. But I thought I'd mention it. I see. This time Neil stood up. Excellent, he said, in a slightly strained voice. Well, in that case, we'll send for you when we're ready for the interview with the mezzanine, and we'll take it from there. Meanwhile, thank you for your time. Canticuseni nodded politely, got up, and left. Why was that so difficult? Neil asked himself. Then he rang the bell, and told the usher he was ready for the merchant. She was younger than he'd expected, a year or so either side of 40, thin-faced, sharp-chinned, dressed in a tent of red velvet with seed pearl trim, her hair short and staked down with combs and gold filigree pins. He had an idea she was some sort of off-relation. The Severinus was distantly connected to the Flargyrus, who trailed in and out of the Ducas family tree like ivy. He'd seen a remarkable thing once. An oak sapling had tried to grow next to a vigorous bushy willow on the warm southern slopes of the Ducas winter grazing. But the willow grew thick quicker, and it twined its withes through the young oak's branches for 10 years or so, and then put on a spurt in its trunk, gradually ripping it out of the ground, until its dead roots drooped in midair like a hung man's feet. He'd come back with men and axes, because the Ducas had always stood for justice on their lands, but he hadn't been able to find the place again. She listened carefully as he explained rather awkwardly what he wanted her to do. She didn't seem surprised at all. You think you can help us? He'd asked. It should be possible, she'd replied. My sister Tianos just joined a consortium with a contract for green sand. I'm sorry, Emil interrupted. Green sand? Casting sand, she almost smiled. For making molds, she said. You know, melting metal and casting. You need a special kind of sand, very fine and even. The Vidani used to get it from the Lonazep cartels, who got it from the Cure Hardy, so obviously it wasn't cheap. But Tiano's consortium has found a deposit of the stuff in the Red River Valley. They can undercut Lonazep by a third and still clear 300%. Good heavens, said Neil, assuming it was expected of him. So your sister's likely to be going back and forth across the mountains quite a bit from now on. She nodded. Actually, it was more of a peck like a woodpecker in a dead tree. The contract is with the Vidani Silver Board. That'll put Tiano right in the center of the Vidani government. It oughtn't be impossible to get the information you want. But it won't be cheap, Neil said, will it? There was a trace of disapproval in her expression. No, she said. At least, Tiano will want a lot of money. If they figure out what she's up to, the very best she can hope for is losing a very lucrative deal. She wants an indemnity in case that happens, and a substantial retainer. And then there's my fee, of course. Neil pursed his lips. I see. 10%, she went on, paid by the customer. You make it sound like, I don't know, a lawyer's bill or something, broken down into items and each one with a fancy name. Quite, she said, unmoved. Professional expenses. If you're in business, you have to be businesslike. Fine. So what does an indemnity plus a retainer, plus a fee, come to, in round numbers? Does it matter? She was frowning slightly. You need this information. I don't imagine Duke Orsi has given you a specific budget. No, he leaves things like that to me, Neil shrugged. We won't quibble about it now. I should think not. She was scolding him, he thought. The security of the duchy is at stake, and, as I hope I've made clear, my sister will be running a substantial risk. The Duca's charm didn't seem to be working as well as it usually did. The scar, Emil thought. Maybe it's as simple as that. If so, it's a damn nuisance. You get used to having your own way on the strength of a smile and a softly spoken word. If the charm's gone, I suppose we'll have to learn some new skills. Eloquence, or maybe even sincerity. Quite, he said. Well, I think we've covered everything. I'll look forward to getting your first report in due course. Thank you very much for your time. As he showed her out and closed the door behind her, Emil was left with the depressing feeling of having done a bad job. Not that it mattered. He was paying money for his service to a professional specialist. There was no requirement that she should like him. Even so, I guess I've got used to being able to make people like me. It makes things easier and they try harder. I'll have to think about that. What he wanted to do most in the world was to go home to his fine house on the east face, send down to the cellars for a few bottles of something better than usual, and spend an hour or two after dinner relaxing, a few games of chess and music. Instead, he had reports to read, letters to write, meetings to prepare for. There was a big marble pillar in the middle cloister of the Ducas house on which were inscribed the various public offices held by members of the family over the past 2.5 centuries. His father had 4 inches, narrowly beating his grandfather. 3 2/3. As a boy, when father had been away from home so often, he'd sat on the neatly trimmed grass and stared up at the pillar, wondering what the unfamiliar words meant. 6 times elected executor of the chamber. Was that a good thing to be? What did an executor do? Was Dad never at home because he was away somewhere executing? For years he'd played secret violent games in which he'd been Orphanatrophus Ducus, Grand Executor, fighting 2 dragons simultaneously or facing down 100 Curie Hardy armed only with a garden rake. 6 months ago, when Hilariat Phocus had died and Orsi had given him his old job, he'd not been able to keep from bursting out laughing when he'd heard what the job title was. No dragons so far, and no Curie Hardy. The executor of the chamber, grand or just plain ordinary, was nominally in charge of the castle laundry. Now he already had 2 inches of his own on the pillar. Gradually, day by day, and step by painful step, he was turning into somebody else. Reports, letters, minutes, agendas. He left the south tower, where the interview rooms were, and headed across the middle cloister to the north wing, in his office. The quickest route took him past the mews, and he noticed that the door was open. He paused. At this time of day there'd be hawks loose, and the door should be kept shut. He frowned and went to close it, but there was a woman sitting in the outer list. He didn't recognize her till she turned her head and smiled at him. "Hello, Meal," she said. "Beatrice." He relaxed slightly. "You left the door open." "That's all right," she replied. "Hanno's put the birds away early. I've been watching him fly the new tiercel." "Ah, right. What new tiercel?" She laughed. "The one you gave Orsi, silly, the peregrine?" Yes, of course. She was right, of course. It had been Orsi's birthday present. His cousin had chosen it, since Meal didn't really know about hawks. It had been expensive, a passenger from the Curidoce country. It had been that word "new" that had thrown him, because Orsi's birthday had been a month ago, just before they set off for the war, and anything that had happened back then belonged to a time so remote as to be practically legendary. "Is it any good?" he asked. "I don't think so," she said. "He says it'll be ready for the start of the season, whenever that is. It'll do Orsi good to get out and enjoy himself after everything that's happened." "We were talking about going out with the hawks just the other day. Is that a new brooch you're wearing? Do you like it?" "Yes," he lied. "Lona's up?" She shook her head. "Vadani, I got it from a merchant. Fancy you noticing, though. Men aren't supposed to notice jewelry and things." She had a box on the bench beside her, a small flat rosewood case. He recognized it as something he'd given her, a writing set, her wedding present from the Duchess. "I know," he said. "That's why I've trained myself in observation. Women think I'm sensitive and considerate." She was looking at his face. "You look tired," she said. "Too many late nights," he said, "and tomorrow I've got to take the mezzanine to see a blacksmith." "What?" "Doesn't matter," he yawned again. "Do excuse me," he said. "I'd better be getting on." "Would you tell Orsi I've seen the Severina woman? He knows what that's about." "Severina? Do you mean the traitor? I think I've met her." She nodded. "Yes, all right. What do you need to see her about, then?" Emil grinned. "Sand." "Sand?" He nodded. "Green sand, to be precise." "Serves me right for asking." As he climbed the stairs to the north tower, he wondered why Beatrice would take her writing set with her when she went to see the falcons. Not that it mattered. That was the trouble with noticing things. He got cluttered up like a hedgehog in dry leaves. Meetings. He made a note in his daybook about Belha Severina, not that there was a great deal to say. Agreed to arrange inquiries through her sister. Terms unspecified. Was that all? He pondered for a while, but couldn't think of anything else to add. It was close, the shape, the structure. He could almost see it, but not quite. Once, not long after he married Ariessa, he designed a clock. He had no idea why he'd done it. It was something he wanted to do, because a clock is a challenge. There's the problem of turning linear into rotary movement. There are issues of gearing, timing, calibration. Anything that diverts or dissipates the energy transmitted from the power source to the components is an open wound. Those in themselves were vast issues, but they'd been settled long ago by the Clockmakers Guild, and their triumph was frozen forever in the 73rd specification. There'd be no point torturing himself, 200 components moving in his mind like maggots, unless he could add something, unless he could improve on the perfection the specification represented. He'd done it in the end. He'd redefined the concept of the escapement, leaping over perfection like a chessboard knight. He'd reduced the friction on the bearing surfaces by a quarter, using lines and angles that only he could see. Slowly and with infinite care, he'd drawn out his design, working late at night when there was no risk of being discovered, until he'd had a complete set of working drawings, perfectly to scale and annotated with all the relevant data, from the gauge of the brass plate with which the parts were to be cut, to the pitch and of the major and minor diameters of the screw threads. When it was complete, perfect, He laid the sheets of crisp, hard drawing paper out on the cellar floor and checked them through thoroughly just in case he'd missed something. Then he'd set light to them and watch them shrivel up into the light gray ash, curled like the petals of a rose. Now he was designing without pens, dividers, straight edge, square calipers, or books of tables. It would be his finest work, even though the objective, the job this machine would be built to do, was so simple as to be utterly mundane. It was like damming a river to run a flywheel, or to drive a gear train to operate a camshaft to move a piston to power a reciprocating blade to sharpen a pencil. Ridiculous to go to such absurd lengths, needing such ingenuity, such a desperate and destructive use of resources, for something he ought to be able to do empty-handed with his eyes shut, but he couldn't. Misguided but powerful men wouldn't let him do it the easy way, and so he was forced to this ludicrously elaborate expedient. It was like having to move the earth in order to slide the table close enough to reach a hairbrush, because he was forbidden to stand up and walk across the room. I didn't start it, he reminded himself. They did that. All I can do is finish it. He had no idea, even with the shape coming into an existence in his mind, how many components the machine would have in the end. Thousands, hundreds of thousands. Someone probably had the resources to calculate the exact figure. He didn't, but it wasn't necessary. He stood up. It was taking him a long time to come to terms with this room. If it was a prison, it was pointlessly elegant. Looking at the fit of the paneling, the depth of relief of the carved friezes, all he could see was the infinity of work and care that had gone into making them. He wouldn't waste that sort of time and effort on a prison cell. If it was a guest room in a fine house, on the other hand, the door would open when he tried the handle, and there wouldn't be guards on the other side of it. The room chafed him like a tight shoe. Every moment he spent in it was uncomfortable because it wasn't right. It wasn't suited to the purpose for which it was being used. That surely was an abomination. I hate these people, he thought. They work by eye and feel. There's no precision here. Decisively, as though closing a big folio of drawings, he put the design away in the back of his mind, and turned his attention to domestic trivia. There was water in the jug. It tasted odd, probably because it was pure, not like the partly filtered sewage they drank at home. Not long ago, they'd brought him food on a tray. He'd eaten it because he was hungry, and he needed to keep his strength up, but he missed the taste of grit. With every second that passed, it became more and more likely that they'd let him live. At least he had that. His elbow twinged. He rubbed it with the palm of his other hand until both patches of skin were warm. The elbow, the whole arm, were excellent machines, and so wickedly versatile. You could brush a cheek or swing a hammer or push in a knife, using a wide redundancy of different approaches and techniques. So many different things a man can do. I could stay here and make myself useful. I could teach these people who are no better than children how to improve themselves. A man could be happy doing that. Instead, there's so many things I could have done if I'd been allowed. The door opened, and the man he'd started to get to know, names, Meal Duckus, came in. Ziani noticed he was looking tired. Here's someone who's a great lord among these people, he thought, but he chases around running errands for his master like a servant. Using the wrong tool for the job, he thought. They didn't know anything. How are you settling in? Duckus said. It was, of course, an absurd question. Fine, except I'm not allowed to leave this horrible room. Fine, Ziani said. The room's very comfortable. Good. Duckus looked guilty. He was thinking, we don't know yet if this man's a prisoner or a guest, so we're hedging our bets. No wonder the poor man was embarrassed. I thought I'd better drop in, see how you're getting on. Ziani nodded. Has the Duke decided yet if he wants to accept my offer? That's what I wanted to talk to you about. Duckus hesitated before he sat down. Maybe he's wondering whether he ought to ask me first, since if I'm a guest, then it would be the polite thing to do. The thing is, he went on, we can't really make that decision, because none of us really understands what it'd mean. So, we'd like you to explain a bit more to one of our experts. He'd be better placed to advise than me, for instance. That's fine by me, Ziani replied. I'm happy to cooperate any way I can. Thank you, Duckus said. That'll be a great help. You see, this expert knows what we're capable of from a technical point of view. He can tell me if we'd actually be able to make use of what you've got to offer, how much it'd cost, how long it would take, that sort of thing. You must appreciate things are difficult for us right now because of the war and everything, and it'd be a huge step for us, obviously. I quite understand, Ziani said. Actually, I'd been thinking a lot about what would have to be done. It would be a long haul, no doubt about that, but I'm absolutely certain it'd be worth it in the end. Duckus looked even more uncomfortable if that was possible. Clearly he didn't want to get caught up in discussion. He's a simple man, Ziani thought, and he's had to learn to be versatile, like using the back of a wrench as a hammer. Sorry we've had to leave you cooped up like this, Duckus went on. Only we've all been very busy, as you'll appreciate. I expect you could do with a bit of fresh air and exercise. No, not really. Yes, that'd be good, Ziani said, but I don't want to put you to any trouble on my account. That's all right, Duckus said. Anyway, I'd better be going. I'll call for you tomorrow morning, and we'll go and see the expert. I look forward to it, Ziani said gravely, though he wanted to laugh. Thank you for stopping by. Duckus went away, and Ziani sat down on the bed, frowning. This man Duckus, how versatile could he be? What was he, exactly? A spring, a gear wheel, a lever, a cam, a sear? It would be delightfully efficient if he could be made to be all of them, but as yet he couldn't be sure of the qualities of his material. Tensile strength, shearing point, ductility, brittleness. How much load could he bear, and how far could he distort before he broke? But all these people are so fragile, he thought. Even I can't do good work with rubbish. In the event, he slept reasonably well. Happiness, beauty, love, the usual bad dreams came to visit him, like dutiful children paying their respects, but on this occasion there was no development, merely the same again. He was back home. It had all been a dreadful mistake. He'd committed no crimes, killed nobody. After his favorite dinner and an hour beside the lamp with an interesting book, he'd gone to bed to sleep and woken up to find his wife lying next to him dead, shrunken, her skin like coarse parchment, her hair white cobwebs, her fingernails curled and brittle, her body as light as rotten wood, her eyes dried up into pebbles, her lips shriveled away from her teeth, one hand, the bones standing out through the skin like the veins of a leaf, closed tenderly on his arm.